The wilderness can turn deadly right before your eyes. From the icy forests of Alaska, where a grizzly bear attacked hunters inside a helicopter, to the remote Carpathian Mountains, where a lone hunter fought to survive 2 days after a brown bear strike. These 6 gripping hunting stories plunge you into high-stakes encounters, relentless danger, and the raw force of nature that tests skill, courage, and survival instincts to their limits. On October 19, 2025, the air over the low ridges of the Alaska Range felt colder than usual, and the thin layer of morning frost clung stubbornly to the tundra while the small utility helicopter waited on a gravel bar beside a winding stretch of the Tatina River. Cole Harris, a seasoned hunter with 20 years of backcountry experience, moved with quiet focus as he began loading the last pieces of gear onto the helicopter floor, and he felt a strong sense of satisfaction knowing that the week ahead would take him and his partner, Brent McAllister, deep into moose country during the late season harvest period. The 2 men had planned the trip carefully, selecting the remote drop-off zone only reachable by air, and they trusted the pilot, Mark Ellison, who had flown hunters across Alaska for more than a decade and understood how quickly conditions could change near the river valleys and spruce forest. The helicopter sat with its side doors open as Cole and Brent worked through their final checks, stacking dry bags filled with layers, ammunition boxes, a compact camp stove, and sealed packages of early-season venison strips that Cole insisted on bringing as extra calories, and the smell of the meat drifted into the crisp air with a faint, sweet heaviness that neither man noticed at first. Brent secured his rifle, a .300 Winchester Magnum favored by many hunters in the region, against the cabin wall while Cole made space for his own rifle and the emergency kit, and the 2 men spoke quietly with gestures, pointing at the placement of packs and the shifting weight distribution that mattered when flying into uneven country. Cole stepped down to gather 2 final dry bags from the ground as Mark climbed into the cockpit, flipping switches and preparing the initial startup, though the rotors remained still for the moment. Cole felt comfortable, confident, and grounded, surrounded by gear he trusted and a plan he had rehearsed, and he believed the morning would unfold smoothly as it had many times before. Yet the wilderness held its own rules, and on that cold October morning, those rules shifted quickly and violently the moment the wind carried the scent of venison toward the dark edge of the tree line about 70 yards away. Brent noticed movement first, a fast and heavy rustle that cut through the silence of the riverbank, and he turned his head just in time to see a massive grizzly breaking from the spruce cover with a speed that startled him, its powerful shoulders rolling in long strides as it barreled across the gravel. Cole had seen grizzlies many times on hunts, but the size of this one and the intensity of its charge sent a shock through him, and he scrambled backward into the helicopter, pushing gear aside as his heart pounded against his ribs. The bear closed the distance with terrifying momentum, driven by the strong scent of meat and the unusual sight of open doors leading into a confined space filled with unfamiliar shapes and smells. Without hesitation, the animal slammed its full weight against the helicopter's open doorway, and the impact shook the entire aircraft so hard that Mark instinctively grabbed the overhead frame as a deep, metallic crack rang through the cabin. Packs toppled over and spilled across the floor, while the bear's huge paws hooked over the threshold, claws slicing across the aluminum and leaving long gouges that made Cole feel as though the metal itself had turned fragile. Brent lunged toward the door, bracing his shoulder against it in an attempt to push it closed, but the bear's strength held it wide open as it roared and shoved its head forward, snapping at anything within reach. Cole scrambled for his rifle, his breath short and ragged, and he fired a warning shot downward toward the gravel outside, the recoil slamming into his shoulder while the explosion of sound echoed along the river. The shot did not frighten the bear in the way Cole hoped. Instead, the massive animal jerked in agitation, its claws tearing deeper grooves as it pushed farther into the cabin, its front paws now scraping the helicopter floor and sending scattered gear sliding toward Cole's boots. Brent felt the force of the animal through the half-closed door, the raw, unstoppable weight of a creature built for dominance in this landscape, and he fought with every ounce of strength he had to keep the door from being ripped completely open. Mark, sensing that the situation had seconds before becoming fatal, reached for the ignition controls with trembling hands, flipping switches and forcing the cold engines into life. The turbine whine grew louder, low at first but rising as the blades began to turn with slow, heavy rotations that built speed with every passing second. Brent shouted for Cole to brace himself, though he used only hand signals and a strained expression, and Cole shifted backward, pressing his back against the opposite wall while the bear shoved deeper into the opening, its hot breath filling the tight space. The rotor wash strengthened as the blades accelerated, sending gravel skittering across the ground and whipping loose fabric inside the cabin. The bear reacted with sudden confusion, its ears flattening as the wind intensified, and when Mark pulled harder on the controls, the aircraft began to lift slightly off the ground, wobbling under the uneven weight and the violent struggle at the doorway. The bear roared again, but this time it stepped back involuntarily as the force of the rotor wash blasted into its face and chest, pushing dust, grit, and cold air against its fur, until it finally dropped from the threshold and backed away several long strides. As the helicopter rose higher and the wash intensified, the Grizzly retreated toward the tree line with one last deep roar before disappearing beneath the spruce canopy. Cole's hand shook as he lowered his rifle. Brent leaned heavily against the now secured door, and Mark kept the helicopter in a steady hover until the threat was fully gone. Only then did the three men realize that even inside a machine built for the sky, the wilderness could still reach them. And on that October morning, the hunters left the gravel bar knowing that no place remained untouchable when a grizzly decided to attack. On October 28, 2024, the rugged canyons of northern Colorado felt colder than usual as the late-season winds moved through the sagebrush hills and carried the sharp scent of winter across the wide, open country. And Wyatt Callahan, an experienced hunter who had spent most of his adult life exploring the steep ridges during mule deer rifle season, took slow, steady steps along a narrow ledge overlooking a vast drainage that dropped sharply into a maze of rocks, broken timber, and long bands of dry brush. He had left camp before dawn with the deliberate confidence of someone who understood the habits of mule deer during the late fall rut, and he carried his well-maintained .270 Winchester on a sling across his chest, trusting the rifle as he trusted the familiar land beneath his boots. Wyatt moved carefully across the uneven terrain, keeping his weight low as he approached the spot he had chosen earlier that morning, a flat shelf of sandstone that allowed him to glass the far slope without exposing his silhouette against the sky. He had hunted mule deer in northern Colorado for more than 15 years, and he had learned to respect how quickly the animals could move when spooked, especially during the peak of rifle season when hunters spread across the ridges and remote pockets of country in search of mature bucks. Wyatt set his pack down, unslung his rifle, and settled into a prone position, raising his binoculars as the afternoon sun threw long, cold shadows across the canyon floor. Below him, a large herd of mule deer rested in the sagebrush, their bodies still and calm in the fading warmth of the day, and Wyatt watched them with a patient eye, noting the mix of does, young bucks, and a few older animals scattered through the brush. He did not rush his assessment because he knew that mule deer often stayed settled until something unexpected shattered their sense of safety, and he felt comfortable lying on the ledge, his breathing slow and steady as he studied the animals for any sign of the mature buck he hoped to take before the season closed. The wind shifted slightly, carrying his scent downhill, and Wyatt knew the herd had probably caught traces of him earlier, though not enough to cause immediate alarm, since they remained bedded and relaxed. He adjusted his position, crawling a few inches forward to get a better angle, and his gloves scraped lightly across the rough sandstone. Everything felt familiar and controlled, the kind of afternoon that made him feel certain he understood the rhythm of the landscape. Yet in the wilderness, calm often turned to chaos without warning, and the shift began with a sudden, sharp sound that echoed faintly from the timbered ridge a quarter-mile away. Wyatt paused and listened, recognizing the high, startled burst of an elk bugle that came from somewhere within a patch of dark timber, and he felt the tension rise instantly through the canyon as the mule deer herd reacted in a wave of movement. A spike buck stood abruptly, ears flicking forward, its muscles tightening with alarm, and before Wyatt could process what triggered the young animal, it bolted directly through the rest of the herd, cutting a wild, reckless path across the sagebrush as it fled the echo of the elk's call. The sudden movement triggered a chain reaction, and within seconds the entire herd erupted into a stampede that pushed them toward the slope below his position, hooves hammering the ground and kicking up clouds of dust as they surged in a panicked wave. Wyatt's heart jumped as he realized the deer were running straight toward his ledge, and he scrambled backward, trying to create space between himself and the oncoming rush, but the terrain gave him little room to maneuver. The first deer passed below his position, but the slope funneled the herd upward, tightening their path until several large does and young bucks crashed onto the same narrow ground he occupied. Rocks tumbled in waves, bouncing off the ledge and clattering down the canyon, and the sound of hooves striking stone filled the air in a chaotic roar that drowned out every other noise. Wyatt grabbed his rifle, but the herd closed the distance too quickly for him to move out of the way, and he felt the raw fear of knowing that even gentle animals could become deadly when driven by panic. One large doe, unable to change direction or slow her momentum, collided hard with his left hip, the force lifting him off balance and sending him sliding down a short slope of loose gravel and broken rock. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and the sting of pain shot through his side as he rolled to a stop against a cluster of small boulders. His rifle skidded several yards away, spinning across the rocks until it came to rest near a patch of dry grass, and Wyatt clawed at the ground as he tried to push himself upward, while the thunder of hooves intensified around him. He crawled behind a large boulder just as several more deer barreled past, their hooves striking the ground inches from where he had fallen, the vibration shaking through the rock and into his bones. Dust filled the air and stung his eyes, and he kept his head low, knowing that even a glancing blow from a hoof could fracture a limb or worse. The herd continued rushing past in a chaotic blur, the mass of bodies moving with frantic energy until, slowly, the thunder began to fade and the dust settled into a thin, swirling haze. Wyatt stayed still for several long seconds, listening for any stragglers, and only when the canyon grew quiet again did he push himself up from behind the boulder. His hip throbbed with deep, spreading pain, and his hands trembled slightly as he made his way toward his rifle, retrieving it from the gravel with a heavy breath. He stood on the ledge, bruised, shaken, and breathing hard, trying to steady himself as he watched the herd disappear across the far ridge in a distant cloud of dust. As he finally exhaled, Wyatt realized that even during the calm moments of late-season hunting, the wild had the power to turn without warning. And on that cold October afternoon, the mule deer had reminded him that not every danger carried teeth or claws, because sometimes the threat came from the unstoppable weight of fear-driven movement in rugged terrain where a hunter could easily be crushed in seconds. On November 1st, 2023, the rugged country of Kodiak Island felt heavier than usual beneath the weight of the early snowstorm that swept through the spruce valleys and pushed thick drifts against the scattered hunting cabins built deep in the island's interior. And Darius Monroe, a seasoned hunter who had spent most of his adult life exploring Alaska's harshest terrain, sat inside a cramped wooden cabin with the uneasy sense that the storm might trap him and his hunting partner, Eli Voss, longer than either had planned. The two men had spent the previous day tracking Sitka black-tailed deer through steep hills blanketed in wet snow, moving through the dense undergrowth until the storm forced them to retreat, and by the time they reached the cabin, they were soaked, exhausted, and ready for a night of rest before trying again once the weather cleared. The cabin felt old but sturdy, built decades earlier by hunters who understood that Kodiak Island demanded thick walls and strong supports, yet even so, the wind found every narrow gap between the logs, whistling through the structure with a cold persistence that made the air inside feel tight and restless. Darius hung his soaked layers near the small wood stove, while Eli repacked gear and checked their remaining supplies, including the venison quarters they had brought in from the previous week's hunt, sealed tightly, but still releasing a faint scent that drifted through the cabin as the night grew colder. Outside, the storm intensified, wind whipping snow against the walls in long, heavy bursts that sounded like distant waves crashing along the coast. Around 2 a.m., the cabin felt swallowed by darkness and wind, and Darius lay half awake on his cot, listening to the roof creak under the shifting weight of snow. Eli slept fitfully on the opposite side of the small room, his breath uneven, and the only warmth came from the dim glow of the stove that crackled quietly with fading embers. The night felt long and uneasy, and Darius sensed that the wilderness outside the thin walls held its own pulse, steady and powerful, driven by the presence of animals far larger than the deer they had come to hunt. Without warning, a deep, heavy thud slammed against the cabin door, rattling the entire structure with such force that Darius jumped upright, his instincts firing instantly. The wind had masked every sound leading up to the impact, and when a second strike followed, harder, louder, more deliberate, the two hunters realized that something huge stood outside, pushing against the cabin with a strength that no storm carried. Eli scrambled to his feet as the door shuddered violently, and the unmistakable sound of massive claws scraping wood cut sharply through the roar of the storm. The third impact splintered the lower half of the door, sending wood fragments flying across the room while a gust of cold air blasted inside. A massive Kodiak bear, easily over 1,600 pounds, pressed its full weight against the weakened structure, its deep growls rising above the wind as it clawed at the frame with a ferocity that made the entire cabin tremble. Cooking pots crashed from their hooks, packs toppled over, and the floor vibrated under the power of each strike as the bear pushed harder, driven by the scent of stored venison and the instinctive hunger that ruled the island's apex predators as winter approached. Darius reached for his .375 H&H, his hands shaking as he loaded a round, knowing that the rifle was powerful enough for dangerous game, but also aware that firing inside the cabin could ricochet or blow through the opposite wall. Eli grabbed a broken wooden chair and slammed it against the door's interior braces, reinforcing the sagging frame as best he could, though each swipe from the bear tore more wood from the outside, exposing jagged edges and widening the gaps that allowed the cold air and snow to pour in. The creature's breath steamed through the cracks, filling the cabin with the musky scent of wet fur and raw strength, and Darius felt the weight of its presence pushing against his chest like a physical force. The bear roared with a low, guttural power that shook dust from the rafters, and it began tearing at the sidewalls next, chewing and clawing at the logs as if testing every weakness in the structure. The storm outside continued to howl, but the bear's fury eclipsed every gust, and the two hunters endured minute after minute of sustained assault as the animal circled the cabin, returning to the door repeatedly, each strike heavier than the last. The stove rattled violently, lanterns tipped over, and supplies scattered across the floor, while the bear worked itself into a frenzy, driven wild by the trapped scent of food and its own relentless hunger. Time stretched painfully as the attack continued, and both men knew that if the bear broke through entirely, the confined space would give them almost no chance to escape or defend themselves effectively. Darius kept the rifle ready, crouched behind a beam where he could anchor himself, his muscles tight with the fear of having to fire at close quarters, while Eli forced his weight against the broken chair, bracing the sagging door, his breath short and unsteady as snow drifted in around his boots. At last, as dawn approached and the storm began to weaken, the bear's roars faded slightly, replaced by heavy breaths and the crunch of snow as it paced outside. One final swipe cracked the remaining wood, but the animal seemed to lose interest as the wind shifted and carried the familiar scents of the forest back through the valley. Slowly, reluctantly, the massive bear retreated into the trees, disappearing into the gray morning light with a final grunt that echoed through the clearing. When silence finally returned, the cabin looked as though a giant had torn through it, with shattered furniture, scattered supplies, broken wall panels, and deep gouges marking nearly every surface. Darius and Eli stood in the wreckage, bruised, exhausted, and shaken by the hours they had spent waiting for the bear to break through. And as the sun rose over the snowy ridges, they understood with painful clarity that on Kodiak Island, even the strongest refuge offered only an illusion of safety when the world's largest land predator decided to strike. On October 16, 2020, the Wyoming backcountry felt wide and empty beneath a cold evening sky as Wade Pierce, a veteran mule deer hunter who trusted the remote wilderness more than most people trusted pavement in towns, finished setting up his small tented camp on a narrow shelf of sagebrush-covered ground high above a winding drainage. The air smelled of frost and dry earth, and Wade appreciated the quiet as he unpacked his gear with the practiced movements of someone who had done this every fall for decades, knowing that mule deer often moved through the ridges once the temperatures dropped, and the winds carried the scent of winter across the high country. Wade had chosen this particular spot because it sat close to a cluster of game trails that cut across the slope, and because a small stream trickled through a shallow dip below his camp, giving him a dependable source of water as long as temperatures stayed above freezing. He pitched his canvas tent, tightened the guy lines, cleared the interior space, and hung a small propane lantern from a short loop near the peak of the tent to dry his damp gloves and bring a bit of warmth into the cramped shelter. The lantern glowed with a soft, steady light, giving the tent a calm feeling that pushed away the cold as evening settled deeper into the landscape. He checked his rifle, a well-used .270 Winchester that had accompanied him on every mule deer hunt for nearly 20 years, then zipped his jacket and stepped outside to gather the last few items he needed before calling it a night. The sky had darkened to a deep blue and the wind drifted gently through the brush, carrying faint scents of pine and distant snowfields. Everything felt controlled and predictable, the kind of evening that made him feel content and confident as he prepared for the following morning's hunt. When he climbed back into the tent, the lantern still hung in place, casting warm light across the canvas walls, and Wade set about organizing his pack so he could begin glassing the ridges before sunrise. He moved slowly, careful not to knock anything over, but as he adjusted a sleeping pad near the tent wall, his boots snagged one leg of the small folding table inside the cramped space. The table rocked, bumped the hanging lantern cord, and before he could react, the lantern swung sideways and struck the edge of the table with a sharp clatter that sent it tumbling downward. The moment the lantern hit the floor, a burst of flame jumped across the canvas wall, the propane feeding a sudden, violent flare that spread faster than Wade could comprehend. The small space filled instantly with thick, choking smoke as the flames crawled upward, licking across backpacks, sleeping bags, and the carefully packed rations he had arranged only minutes earlier. Heat surged through the tent, and Wade felt the air thicken against his skin as panic surged inside him, pushing aside the controlled confidence he normally carried on every hunt. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket and threw it against the flames, smothering part of the fire with desperate force, but the blanket slipped as the heat intensified, and several sparks jumped through the open tent flap, landing in the dry brush just outside. The cold evening air fed those sparks quickly, and small flickers of orange spread across the brittle sage with terrifying speed, forming a chain of tiny fires that connected, strengthened, and grew into a single advancing front that lit the ridge with an eerie glow. Inside the tent, smoke swirled thick and black, burning his throat and making his eyes water uncontrollably. Wade staggered backward, coughing hard as the interior filled with heat that pressed against every inch of exposed skin, and he realized that staying inside even a second longer would be fatal. He lunged toward his small essentials pack, grabbed it by the strap, and forced his way out through the tent flap as flames roared behind him, engulfing the canvas in a violent rush that lit the clearing with a sudden, blinding burst of light. Outside, the brush fire gained strength, pushed by small gusts of wind that carried burning debris into the surrounding sage. Wade stumbled away from the fire line, dragging his pack as he moved toward the darker, rockier ground beyond the reach of the thick vegetation. Smoke followed him across the slope, curling through the trees and filling the narrow drainage with a dense haze that made every breath feel sharp and painful. He pushed himself uphill, navigating rocky terrain with the urgent awareness that any hesitation could trap him between the flames and the steep drop below. For hours, he moved along ridges and dipped into shallow folds in the landscape, always staying ahead of the fire but never far enough to feel safe, using the faint moonlight to pick his path while keeping one ear tuned to the crackle of burning brush behind him. He reached the small stream he had scouted earlier and followed it, as far as he could, letting the cold water cool his hands and face while he crossed slick stones and pushed through low branches that scraped against his shoulders. The night stretched long, and his lungs burned from smoke as the fire cast a faint glow behind him, turning the ridges into dark silhouettes under a pale, shifting sky. He kept moving because stopping meant letting exhaustion catch him, and he knew that if he collapsed in the wrong place, the fire could sweep over him before dawn. When morning finally arrived, the air felt lighter and the wind calmer, and Wade made his way toward the nearest ranger trail, a narrow path that wound through a patch of scattered pines. He walked slowly, his clothes singed, his beard covered in soot, and his throat raw from hours of smoke inhalation. But he remained steady on his feet, driven by the simple need to reach safety. As the sun rose over the Wyoming backcountry, Wade finally stopped to look back across the ridges he had crossed through the night. His camp was gone, burned down to scorched ground and twisted metal, but he had survived, and he understood with new clarity that in the wilderness, fire could be just as deadly as any predator, striking without warning and forcing a hunter to rely on instinct, endurance, and sheer determination to stay alive. On March 3, 2025, the small fishing village of Ny-Ålesund on northern Svalbard lay under a hard, biting wind that swept across narrow streets, layered in ice and snow. And Erik Solberg, a Norwegian hunter with decades of experience navigating Arctic terrain, moved among the cabins helping locals secure their homes and stock supplies for the long polar night that would soon lock the settlement under near-constant darkness. The air was sharp and cold, carrying a mixture of sea salt and the faint odor of dried fish that hung in the storage sheds, and the wind pushed frozen flakes against the sides of buildings, rattling shutters and tossing snow across the snow-packed paths between huts. Erik had spent years in the Arctic, and he knew better than most how quickly calm could turn into danger when humans intersected with the domain of apex predators. He checked the fastenings on one cabin door while carrying a crate of salted fish to the storage shack, mindful of the fragile ice that edged the coastline, and spoke briefly with a villager, gesturing toward the supplies stacked along the narrow alley. Everything felt routine, methodical, and necessary as the settlement braced for winter. Yet, beneath the quiet rhythm of chores lay the ever-present understanding that polar bears roam the drifting ice, searching for food in a landscape that offered little mercy for hunger or mistake. The wind gusted harder, cutting sharply across the streets, and Erik heard a deep, heavy thud against one of the outer storage sheds. At first, he assumed a block of ice had shifted in the gale, but the sound repeated, louder, more deliberate, followed by a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground beneath his boots. He froze, scanning the direction of the noise, and his trained eye immediately spotted movement against the white backdrop. A massive polar bear, likely over 1,200 pounds, had pushed from the edge of the drifting ice onto the narrow street, drawn by the scent of fish and dried meat stored carelessly in barrels and crates outside several cabins. The animal rammed an ice-crusted door, splintering wood and sending frozen fragments skittering across the hard-packed snow, and barrels toppled, clanging loudly as the bear clawed at the side of the building. Villagers shrieked, diving for cover behind sleds, snowbanks, and low fences, while children's cries pierced the sharp Arctic wind. Erik felt the full weight of urgency press against his chest as he ducked behind a storage crate, his fingers closing tightly around the stock of his 12-gauge Benelli, its smooth black metal cool and familiar under his grip. He knew the bear's attention was drawn to the stored fish and the meat rations, and that in this environment, a hungry polar bear could destroy property and injure anyone caught too close faster than humans could react. Eric stepped cautiously into a clearer stretch of street, aiming his shotgun toward the animal. He fired a warning slug into the snow near its massive paws, the explosion of air and powder echoing off the surrounding cabins. The polar bear froze for a heartbeat, lifting its head to sniff the air, its dark eyes locking momentarily on the hunter, and then it swiped at a crate with its enormous claw, sending it flying across the street and scattering dried fish and small tools. The bear's roar was low, guttural, and full of authority, vibrating through the icy ground, and Eric realized that while the shots had startled it, they had done nothing to diminish the threat of its sheer size and strength. For tense minutes, the bear prowled the village, moving deliberately between buildings, smashing doors, overturning barrels, and leaving deep claw marks across siding and storage sheds. Villagers huddled in makeshift shelters, holding each other close and murmuring words of fear and caution while Eric kept his aim trained on the bear, shifting slowly to keep himself between the creature and those most exposed. Each movement of the polar bear carried immense force, sending clouds of snow and ice into the air, and Eric felt the vibration of every heavy step through the frozen ground, knowing that one wrong position could put him directly in harm's way. The wind continued to whip around the narrow streets, reducing visibility with swirling snow and carrying the scent of the scattered supplies across the village, tempting the bear to linger. Yet, gradually, the animal's attention shifted. The repeated loud shots and the commotion caused it to pause, lift its massive head, and glance toward the open stretches of drifting ice beyond the settlement, where the white expanse promised more hunting opportunities and the possibility of prey untouched by humans. With a final swipe at a crate, scattering the last of the fish, the bear turned slowly, moving toward the snow-laden edge of the village, its huge paws crunching over packed ice and snow, leaving deep impressions that would remain long after its departure. By mid-morning, the polar bear had disappeared into the pale horizon of drifting ice, leaving a trail of destruction behind. Splintered doors, overturned barrels, scattered provisions, and snow-dusted prints marking the chaotic path it had taken through the narrow streets. Several villagers nursed bruises and scrapes from flying debris and slips on the ice, but no one was killed, and the emergency had been contained thanks in part to Eric's quick reaction and the villagers' knowledge of cover and shelter. As Eric surveyed the aftermath, he realized the stark truth of life in the Arctic. Human settlements, while providing temporary shelter and a sense of control, were only fragile obstacles to a hungry polar bear, and even careful planning, preparedness, and years of experience could not eliminate the unpredictable danger that existed when humans intersected with the domain of the planet's largest land carnivore. The village was shaken, supplies were ruined, and the wind still carried the sharp bite of winter, but Eric knew that surviving the Arctic meant respect, vigilance, and the understanding that nature's most formidable hunters moved with absolute authority, and no human-made barrier could ever fully contain them. On September 27, 2023, the Carpathian Mountains of Romania were alive with the crisp scent of early autumn as Mateo Dragomir, a skilled hunter with years of experience tracking red deer in steep, remote terrain, navigated dense spruce and alder along the sides of a deep river gorge. The morning mist clung to the branches, draping the forest in a thin veil that made visibility difficult, while the sound of rushing water far below filled the narrow ravine with a constant, low roar. Mateo moved cautiously, scanning the forest floor for fresh tracks, Noting the signs of deer bedding and feeding, and adjusting the strap of his .30-06 rifle as he advanced with careful, deliberate steps over wet leaves and hidden roots. He paused on a small outcropping, kneeling to examine a set of fresh red deer tracks pressed into the soft soil near the river's edge. And the thrill of the hunt pulsed through him in a familiar rhythm. The careful observation and quiet anticipation, a ritual he had perfected over years of backcountry excursions. He felt connected to the wilderness, attuned to its sounds and smells, and confident in his ability to move unnoticed, to remain calm and precise, and to respect the immense power of the land he traversed. Yet, in those same moments of focus, he remained unaware of the shadow moving silently through the spruce just 50 feet beyond him, the massive European brown bear whose presence would soon transform skill and patience into a desperate fight for survival. The attack came without warning. Mateo bent forward, examining the tracks more closely, when a deep, resonant growl rolled through the forest, shaking leaves from the lower branches and echoing across the steep canyon walls. The bear burst from cover with terrifying speed, its enormous shoulders heaving as it charged through the underbrush, and Mateo reacted instinctively, swinging his rifle upward and firing a shot that grazed the animal's thick fur, but did little to deter it. The bear's roar was deafening in the confined canyon, a raw, primal sound that reverberated off the rocks and pressed against Mateo's chest with a physical force. Before he could fire again, the bear swiped at him with a massive paw, knocking him backward against a tree, and its jaws snapped dangerously close to his arm, tearing his clothing and leaving deep lacerations across his shoulder. Pain exploded across his thigh when the bear's weight crashed into him, and he felt the sudden, violent rush of blood and adrenaline surge through his body. Mateo rolled into a shallow depression along the forest floor, fumbling with the rifle as the bear circled and swiped again, the claws gouging the earth and snapping branches in its wake. Using every ounce of strength, he fired a second round, grazing the bear once more. But it had already turned its fury into momentum and lunged away into the denser spruce, leaving Mateo battered, bleeding, and in shock. He could feel the sting of every wound, the raw heat of blood and bruises, and the cold reality that he was alone in rugged terrain with limited resources and an active predator nearby. Summoning focus from deep within, Mateo crawled away from the main trail, keeping low to the ground and moving toward a location he had memorized from previous hunts, a ranger post several kilometers downstream along the river. Every movement required careful calculation. Each step carried the potential for slipping on wet leaves, twisting an ankle on hidden roots, or drawing the attention of the bear if it had returned to follow him. Mateo used his compass to navigate through the dense forest, pausing often to control the bleeding with strips of his torn clothing and to catch his breath, each moment of rest punctuated by the haunting sound of snapping branches or distant animal calls that could mask the bear's return. For 2 days and nights, he survived in the shadow of exhaustion and the constant risk of renewed attack, drinking only small amounts of water from the icy stream, rationing the minimal food in his pack, and keeping pressure on his wounds with improvised bandages. At night, he found shallow depressions in the forest floor or slight hollows along the riverbank to huddle in, using his jacket to shield himself from the chill and curling tightly to conserve warmth while remaining alert to every sound. Each rustle of leaves, each distant growl, forced him to tense and prepare for another encounter that might end in fatal injury. During daylight, he forced himself to continue moving, leveraging the terrain for cover, sliding along hidden gullies, and using the natural contours of the spruce to break line of sight while conserving energy and monitoring the compass. Pain, thirst, and fatigue pressed relentlessly against his body, but he refused to surrender to despair, focusing on reaching the ranger post that represented his only real chance of survival. Every step demanded an intimate awareness of the land, of rock and root, and a careful balance between speed and caution as he crept along the steep, narrow pathways cut by water and erosion. On the morning of the third day, Mateo finally stumbled into the clearing where the Forest Patrol had set up a seasonal post. Weak, bruised, dehydrated, and covered in blood and dirt, but alive. The Rangers rushed to stabilize him and radioed for an airlift, and shortly afterward, he was lifted out of the Carpathians, the dense forest and winding river slopes, falling away beneath the helicopter as he felt the first real relief in days. His body was battered and sore, his mind exhausted. Yet the overwhelming truth remained clear. Survival in the backcountry required endurance, improvisation, and the will to press forward even when every instinct screamed for rest or resignation. Mateo's ordeal became a testament to the strength of human determination in the face of nature's raw power, a story of endurance that emphasized not only the risks of tracking large game in rugged European wilderness, but the constant presence of apex predators whose size, speed, and strength demanded respect at every step. The brown bear, unrestrained and formidable, had forced him to rely on experience, careful planning, and improvisation to survive, leaving an indelible mark on his memory and a profound respect for the unforgiving landscape of the Carpathians.